Hello, beautifully chronically ill people. This is a niche video just to say a few words about how I understand this whole myth and myths around brain retraining. And that's been in the news again because there was this piece in Wired by Alan Levinovitz, which touched on it in a way that understandably so much of the community found very flawed and unconstructive. So let me say a few things about that just as a kind of off-the-cuff set of remarks for people living with acute chronic illness, above all ME and long COVID. So this is a very niche video, just 50 people are going to see it on my ME Diary channel. So what my first piece of purely emotional advice to you guys is about something like the Wired piece is, yes, if something like that is out there, it's information not great for the community, but understand that it's as big as it is and not bigger than that, right? So let me just talk to you as though you and I are having a cup of chamomile tea together. I am an infinitesimally microscopic public figure. You know, I have a couple of YouTube channels, one with 100k subs, another with 200k subs. And I talk there about politics, about authoritarianism, about leading a life in the world with democratic decline. How many people would have read that Wired article? You know, beginning to end. Probably the same number, maybe slightly higher, than watch a daily video from me on my second YouTube channel, just sitting here on my bum in bed. In fact, not quite sitting, but more reclining for microvascular reasons, and listening to me say something fairly off the cuff on a daily basis, right? Infinitesimal. So even if we got Nancy Klimas to write that Wired piece instead of Alan Levinovitz or one of the other 5 or 10 great ME long COVID clinicians or researchers, to your life, right, between now and when you're buried, is going to make no difference at all, 99.9% of the time. Sometimes something like that can make a difference because one particular individual with influence or power wakes up, but it's rare. So basically, don't overtax your nervous system by reacting to something that is a minority pursuit, right? In fact, a lot of the publicity for the piece was generated by the critical response to it. So make it as big as it is, but not bigger than it is. Understand that, right? It's nothing in the information environment. Now about brain retraining itself. When you get sick with long COVID or ME, you gotta have several avenues for what you're doing about it. I'm going to name them, and there are 4 to start with, but then we could start adding more. You could end up with 7 or 11. So what are the first 4? The first 4 are meds, right? What medications, hopefully if you're lucky enough to see a good specialist in the condition, are you on? It might be immune modulators, it might be antivirals, it might be God knows what else. That's one avenue. The second avenue is nutraceuticals, or what people might call supplements. And most of you are going to be on a lot of those for particular issues you're trying to target, which there is evidence for certain nutraceuticals targeting. For instance, mast cell activation syndrome, right? You're going to be in a lot of stuff for that. And some of it could be med, but some of it could be in the realm of supplements. Totally legitimate second path, really important, right? Third path, rest, meditation, yoga nidra. Often for people with long COVID and ME, it means that you have to do these exercises lying down, but that's huge. It's absolutely huge. Now, what does it mean to rest or meditate for somebody who is already horizontal in bed the vast majority of the time is a difficult question. But it's still an important question. You've got to find your own version of that. And it's difficult. It's really difficult because the difference between just lying down and lying down in that systematic way that yoga nidra might make you lie down, for example, it's a very big difference. It's a very painful difference. It's a very hard difference, because when your body is in commotion, there's so much going on, so much suffering going on, it's very difficult to relax and let go. But it's only that kind of relaxation and letting go that can get you closer to moments when your battery is not being depleted. So how do you create these moments? So when you rest, when you meditate, this is hard, this is work. You're doing something special, you're doing something sacred. So that's the third path. The fourth path, obviously, is going to be your mise en place. It's going to be everything that surrounds you on a daily basis. What do you need? You might need a level of darkness, a level of quiet, a level of minimal interaction with other humans, tragically. You might need some setup in bed like the one I'm speaking to you on. I'm in my bed, my legs are stretched out, and I've got a table wheeled over my bed. It's on wheels, and it's got my mic, my light, it's got everything under the sun. So this is your mise en place. What's your setup for eating, if you're able to eat without being, tube fed? What's that look like? How do you eat? Do you sit up in bed? Blah blah blah. So all of that mise en place, that's very important. So you have a kind of a minimally decent setup. How much light is going to come into your room? Blah blah blah. And then you can start adding to these four paths. So we've done drugs, we've done supplements, we've got rest and meditation, we've got your mise en place, and somebody might say, well, what about number 5, brain retraining? Right? So let's talk about it. Unfortunately, the story begins in a very difficult place, and the difficult place is, if you like, the birth of something like the biopsychosocial model of disease in the, let's say, 1970s. Now, if brain retraining is associated and thought of as being an application in practice of the biopsychosocial model of your disease, then it's a bad thing. Why? Because the biopsychosocial model doesn't just fail to apply to your illness, it fails to apply to anything, right? As a professional philosopher, I have not seen a single plausible account of how it might possibly be coherent. Diane O'Leary, who writes very well about this, points out that the initial problem is something like an unbelievable and caricatural misunderstanding, funnily enough, of debates about dualism in philosophy. And so what you've got is this very strange incorporation of a misrepresented picture of debate about dualism into psychiatry and medicine more widely 50 years ago. And so what was incorporated was the idea that dualism is false, that everything is physical, including mental things being physical. But that completely missed the point of the debate that they were actually trying to borrow from in philosophy, because what essentially happened in philosophy is that there was more or less a consensus that dualism in a caricatural sense was false, right? That everything is in the end physical. That was accepted by consensus as true. But what wasn't accepted by consensus as true and was rejected by consensus as false is the idea that you can reduce the mental to the physical, right? You can't have a biological explanation of why Harry has fallen in love with Sally. And so you've got a rejection of dualism of the kind that says there can be some magical things that operate outside of the laws of physics, but an acceptance of dualism in the sense that you accept that emotional and psychological descriptions of the world, of your experience, are never going to be reducible to physical ones, because they are necessarily perspectival, they're necessarily embodied, they're the descriptions of agents purposively negotiating the world. Right? And that means that, of course, everything that happens psychologically for you is going to have a physical correlate, because the first type of dualism is false, but it's not going to be reducible to its physical correlates for obvious reasons. And this very, very bizarre caricature and misrepresentation of an event in philosophy led in practice to a situation where there was, first of all, the belief that everything psychological is physical, which is in one sense true, but in another sense false. That led to a situation whereby unknown medical conditions in practice that weren't known for reasons of insufficient research or for reasons of discrimination and prejudice, blah, blah, blah. It came to be that these conditions began to get labeled as psychological, even though they weren't. But what, as Diane O'Leary argues, led to that is that initial sort of infantile misunderstanding on the part of psychiatrists and doctors more widely of a debate that they were borrowing from essentially academic philosophy. So the BPS model is a kind of disaster that looks embarrassing both analytically and sociologically in terms of its inception. And so when people come along and say, look, this is the biopsychosocial model, and on its basis we're going to recommend brain retraining, we've got an issue. Because it's a misunderstanding of everything. It's a misunderstanding of philosophical debates about dualism. It's a misunderstanding of the relations between the mind and the body. And therefore we can just dismiss it. However, that doesn't mean that brain retraining as a technique has no place in managing long COVID or ME, and has no place in your multi-pronged dance whereby you try to get to a slightly less shit plateau in your illness. So let me just give you an example. Imagine that you take a trip in a car, which is very rare for you with this illness, and it's quite bouncy. And that has some kind of effect on your brainstem, right? You can have brainstem problems resulting from inflammation, but you can also have brainstem problems resulting from structural impact. And often it's hard to tell the difference between the two. And we know that these structural stories are a big part of ME and long COVID because we've got people already with hereditary tissue disorders getting these illnesses, but then these illnesses, part of what they do to you is make these hereditary tissue tendencies get much worse. So imagine that you had that experience, and then as a result you've got some brainstem problems that cause you having difficulty breathing or swallowing. Could you do a bit of brain retraining on that and reduce these symptoms as a result by 10 or 20%? Possibly, possibly. And so this is interesting, right? So we've got brain retraining applying to something whereby you've got no psychological cause at all to the problem, right? So the validity of brain retraining as a technique is not at all dependent on the BPS model, in principle at least. And it's not dependent on the initial cause being to any degree psychological at all, right? And speaking generally, this is so for two reasons. Number one, it's incredibly hard for your mind and for your nervous system to deal with extreme illness, and therefore training yourself to respond more constructively to extreme symptoms can be helpful, right? So one thing I do is I make sure that I don't have that thicket of tension and stress attached to a symptom about which I can't do anything, but about the thicket of stress and anxiety and the tension attached to it, I can do something, right? So that's one path. But the other path is that in part these are stress disorder illnesses. There are many other things illnesses, but they're also stress disorder illnesses, and therefore they screw you up at the level of your vagus nerve, at the level of your brainstem, and therefore it is actually possible to mitigate partly the dysfunction that is biologically caused, non-psychologically caused, with a few of these. You wouldn't even call them psychological interventions. They're whatever. They're neuro retraining interventions. So how do we then balance all of this? Because instinctively you feel, okay, well, this point about brain retraining makes sense, but I still feel really bad about all of these brain retraining courses out there. Surely they do harm. So how do we think about this? Well, the problem with a lot of the brain retraining courses is that they say, A, we fix the illness, which is false. They say, B, we grasp the pathophysiology of the illness, right? We have a theory of the cause of the illness, which is like some kind of amygdala misfunctioning, right? False. Third, these courses have no way to distinguish between people who have long COVID and me and people who don't. And therefore, the vast majority of people who improve with them don't have the problem to begin with. But here is the key question. Could somebody, in principle, with a mere long COVID, recover in part with the help of brain retraining? Now, we know recovery rates are low. That's something like 5% for ME. They could be higher for long COVID or even long COVID mediated ME. They could be, let's say, 10, 15%. God knows what they are. We don't know. And the answer is, yeah. How? Tipping points. How do the people who do recover? They recover through tipping points. It could be that getting the right drugs. For somebody, it could be, I don't know, Abilify or Immunovir, boom, pushes them over the line and begins to tilt their system in a positive direction. Possible. It could be that for some people, just through meditation, they get over that tipping point, right? For others, it could be some kind of single intervention they have, some kind of single drug intervention they have. That's not about taking something long term. It's possible. Therefore, could brain retraining tilt somebody over the line in that way, together with the way 10 other things can tilt them over the line, from drugs to supplements to getting the mise en place right to rest and meditation? Yeah, they could. And so therefore, I'm confident that some people have achieved this tipping point just the way other people have achieved that tipping point by other means, that some people have achieved it by brain retraining. It's a minority. My instinctual sense is that, unfortunately, for most people with ME and long COVID, given the current state of research, you can't get to that tipping point. But people whose systems are a little bit more receptive to tipping points can be tipped in the right direction. That's how there's a small but larger recovery rate stat for patients of the most esteemed ME clinicians and researchers, like Nancy Klimas, one of my doctors. Right? Why do her patients have a higher rate of recovery? Because she's going to throw everything available at them. And for a minority of patients, that's going to tilt them over the line. And in practice, it might mean that if you're in the hands of a doc like that, your recovery rate goes from 5% to 12%. Right? It's never going to get to 80% because we just don't have the science for that yet. And could it be that in some people's case, that role is played by brain retraining? Yeah, sure, why not? I believe I've seen it happen, in fact, for some people. And so we don't need to deny that, but we do need to deny all of the things that I've just said are false in the video. So that's how I think about it. Turn it another way around. Imagine that we have a private conversation with the leading 10, 15 experts in ME in the world, who basically all believe it's a completely physically based illness. There's no illness perpetuating beliefs. There's none of the BPS story, none of whatever else Simon Wesley and co want to attach to this illness. What would they say about something like the stuff Gupta does? They'd say, well, yeah, obviously be careful around the pathogenesis story, right? They don't have an account of the illness, which then allows them to fix the illness, right? Be careful about pushing yourself too much, right? Breaking the pacing rules you need to set for yourself so that you don't provoke the illness into permanent deterioration via pushing beyond your post-exertional malaise boundary. But are they sort of retraining the right part of the brain as far as the nervous system dysfunction with this illness goes? Yeah, they are. So it's in principle, if you use it correctly as a tool, one of the 5, 10, 15 things you can use. It might be that it's just no good for some patients at all, even as a tool, as a technique, but it is the case that for some patients it is a useful tool and a useful technique, right? Now, we have got a problem, right? Because these people would absolutely not accept what I've just said. They wouldn't accept that they need to give up on the pathogenesis story. They wouldn't accept that they need to give up on the story that they fix the illness. They wouldn't accept that they need to give up on the story that they actually have any clue whatsoever about what the problem is with the people they try to help, because they don't know whether they've got ME, long COVID, whether they've got depression-mediated fatigue, right? They just don't know that. So that they're not going to admit any of that. But do they offer techniques that for some ME and long COVID patients can be put into a toolbox and have a positive impact in rare cases on tipping points, but in more cases just on, interacting with the plateau of your illness and maybe getting that plateau to be 4%, 8% more? They could. Yeah, they could. So that's the problem. Now back to the Levinowitz piece. The problem with Alan is that if he were to debate this with somebody like me, he'd know quite a lot about long COVID and ME, just sort of factually. He'd know a lot about brain retraining, but there'd just be too big asymmetries. There's no possibility for debate meaningfully. What would be the asymmetry? Well, on the bio research into ME, long COVID, he'd probably know 10% of what I know. And I don't know that much, but it'd be 10%. On brain retraining, he'd know probably 5% of what I know. Right? I've thought about brain retraining as a tool for 20 years with ME. And so even on the thing he's pushing, he has a fraction of the understanding of it that I have. And on actually the day-to-day experience of the illness, he's got very little understanding at all. So maybe 1% of my understanding. And so therefore, he is sort of quarter-knowingly speculating about things to which I already have the answer. And the answer is something like what I've given in this video. And so it's difficult debating it because he doesn't see the Dunning-Kruger position he has taken. And that creates, I'm not saying there's any bad intent there, but that creates a problem. So that's my 2 cents. Be protective if some of what I've said challenged you, and be protective of yourself if I've gone on so long that it's broken your health a little bit for the day.